Welcome to the Podcast Editing and Support Show. My name is Dave. Are you ready? Are you ready? Let's go. We're going to start the episode right now. Happy to have you here. Let's do this. Hey, welcome back to the podcast. Glad to be with you. It's Dave here. We're talking all things podcast editing and support. You're in the right place. If you want to start a podcast business and support podcasters, or if you're a podcaster looking to find an editor for your podcast, you're like, I'm done with all this behind the scenes stuff. I want to go play with my kids. Hey, we're here for you. I'd love to talk to you about how we can help you on your journey as a podcaster and support you behind the scenes. We'll take care of all that stuff you don't want to do, and you can focus on better things. You got better things to do with your time than edit your podcast, right? Yeah, we can take care of that for you. We're going to look at today a little bit more around our little mini series we're doing about implementing project-based pricing for podcast services. Today, I want to kind of look at pricing strategies that can transform your podcast business. And we're going to get into that here on the podcast. Thank you for pressing play. Thank you for being curious enough to come and check out the show. I'd love to know where you're listening around the world. I can see you in my stats, but I'd love to hear your voice. You can always reach out through podcasteditingandsupport.com. There's a little speak pipe logo there, a little icon. Click on it. You can leave me a voice message. I'd love to hear your amazing, wonderful voice from wherever you are in the world. Just tell me where you are, and I'd love to hear your voice in my email. It makes me so happy. That would be something you can do for me, okay? I'll do the podcast. You send me a voice message, and we'll all get along because we're working together. I love it. So we're going to look at pricing strategies to transform your podcast business. Thanks for pressing play. Here we go. As podcast editors, I think the one thing we don't spend a great deal of time on and detailed review, which can turn around and hurt us in the end, is we don't spend a lot of time estimating the investment for podcast editing and support businesses. And we think we know how long things are going to take, and then we go and get clients. Then we realize that we have way too much client work and not enough hands and time, and then we start scrambling. Or we have too few clients, and we're not making enough to support us, and now we're desperate because we got to pay for the car payment, and the kids need new shoes again, and the dog needs to go see the vet, and we're like, where's this money coming from? And not having enough clients can also be a problem for us. So we need to be very realistic about how we estimate our time and what's available to us for doing this as a side hustle, for doing this to supplement our income, or we want to replace our income by being a podcast editing and support person. Then we need to really understand what kind of time is available to us. How much can we commit? Do we got little kids at home? Do we have other responsibilities that take us away from doing this business? To be very realistic about where we're at, before we jump head first into podcast editing and support, we should really estimate the amount of time that we have available. So let's look at this in a little more detail. A few things I'd like for you to consider around estimating your time is to break down projects into specific tasks and then estimate the time it's going to be required for each of these tasks. By doing this, you can then have some real tangible numbers to decide on how many tasks you can do within a period of time, and then it also goes to pricing as well, how much this is going to cost. But breaking down projects into specific tasks is a great starting point for you. Now, if you edit your own podcast historically, you kind of have an idea how long it takes to do a certain amount of editing. So that's a good starting point. Maybe start breaking it down into sections and start attaching time to it. Over time, you're going to get faster at editing. There's going to be more tools that come your way. It's all going to speed up the process. But right now, what is realistic for you? And that's a good starting point in this conversation and for your business. Break down those tasks and give them, assign time to them so you can balance out how much time it takes to do a 30-minute episode, 60-minute episode, multi-voice podcast with many people talking, soundscaping, music, intros, outros, blah, 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 blah. It goes on and on. Break down everything into specific tasks and give it a time. It's really going to help. Another thing to consider is all around script writing. So now this is interesting because you're writing the script to be voiced on the podcast. So it's ahead of the recording. Now, the numbers are going to vary depending on what type of podcast and all of the research that goes into it. But you can budget to like 40 hours of research for one episode. Some shows do even more than that. They're out traveling, they're talking to people on the street, they're pulling in all kinds of things to make an episode. There's a lot of work involved. And as a podcaster, you don't have time to do all that. So maybe your podcast editing and support person can be your research liaison. They can go out and do all the work for you, bring you back the results and all the assets, and then you're compiling them together as the support person for your podcast drafts your script for you as a starting point. Wouldn't that be great to have somebody do that for you so you don't have to invest 40 plus hours in research and all of the behind the scenes stuff? Hand it off to someone, let them do that for you, do all the heavy lifting, bring it back to you, and you tweak and then record. It's great. Another part of all this is the actual time it takes to actually record the audio. We need to allocate approximately about 15 hours of recording time if you're going to be doing multiple things in your show. So not all the time is your podcast going to be recorded in 30 minutes, 60 minutes, and be done. Sometimes there's additional assets required. There's commercials, there are intros and outros. There are special features you're going to add to the podcast. There's going to be all kinds of additional things that come along with the podcast. So to think that you only need a 30-minute window for a 30-minute episode might not be realistic, and you might overload yourself. So give yourself some time. What is it for a 1-hour podcast? How much time should you set aside to record a 1-hour podcast? Again, it's going to get easier over time. But in the beginning, give yourself some grace. And just like when you set up your calendar, you don't have back-to-back-to-back-to-back meetings. You'll never leave your seat. You leave a little buffer in between there so you have some time. Some things go long, some things go short. Some people don't show up for their meetings. Yeah, you want to have some flexibility in time. So give yourself a guide, some guardrails for your podcast. On top of the audio recording, there's the editing side. Now, again, numbers are going to vary wildly depending on what type of podcast you're editing for. An audio journal type podcast, like a storytelling podcast with music and sound effects and all kinds of chapters, and you're doing an audiobook, really. There's a lot of time and effort required to do that. Way above a single hosted episode, 15 minutes long, 2 main points, and an intro and outro. That's a completely different thing. So you need to understand where your sweet spot is for how much audio editing will take. Some podcasters, get ready for this, some podcasters can spend up to 20 hours per episode to edit individual tracks, adding in all the different elements and components of the podcast. Now, for me and my 8 different shows, the only exception would be the Daily Santa podcast, which is a 25-episode series of episodes in December for kids, 25 in a row, counting down to Christmas. Those episodes I recorded the day before they were due, and some of them took me 8 hours to do because there's like 20 to 30 different individual tracks in one podcast recording. A lot of moving pieces, a lot of things happening in the background. It was a huge task, but it was really fun. But it really stretched all the limits of what I could do in that 8 hours. And I did that daily for 25 days in a row. Every day, even weekends, all the time. I recorded the episode and went live the next day. So it was either recording or posting every day for 25 days. So think about it. You could be spending a lot of time in that editing suite, and you need to give yourself some grace with time. There's also a thing called deep editing. Now, deep editing, that's when you're really getting more into the finer details of what's happening. There's a lot of tweaking, maybe repairs that are happening to the audio. So estimate about 1 to 4 hours, depending on the podcast length, to get in and do some deep editing. Again, this is way beyond simple ums and ahs, intros and outros. This is getting really into the content and dissecting and putting things together. Normal editing, you can bank on between maybe 30 minutes to about an hour for basic edits. Again, we're talking just the simple things. There's also the intros and outros. If you're recording intros and outros, that's one thing. If they're already pre-recorded, that's a little easier. But again, you're going to think about adding 1 to 3 hours, depending on how much work is happening in the podcast and how frequent you're changing your intros and outros. All of these things need to be accounted for when you sit down with a new client so you understand the scope of what's being asked from you by your new podcaster you're working with. So estimate your time. Get a good idea, a well-rounded picture. This type of episode with this type of host or co-host or guest or no guest, and then this length of episode, and give yourself some parameters. It's going to help you when you sit down with your next podcaster to talk money and time. There's also another component we can use in this is to go back and look at some historical data from other projects you've done in the past to help guide your estimates. And it's going to become a sounding board for you as you plan out the future. A lot of people like to use like a time tracker, which keeps track of what you're doing and when. I've never been that person myself personally. I've never actually used those tracking things. For me, I'm pretty strict and disciplined with my time and very efficient with what I do because I've been doing it for a long time and I know my tools. So for me, I haven't ever used a time tracker, but it might be something that benefits you. We all learn differently. We all act differently. We show up in this world differently. So leverage the tools available to you. And if a time tracker helps you to stay on course and monitor how long a specific task takes, then that might be a huge benefit to you if that works for you. So look into some time trackers. They're always available on app stores, and there's a lot of different sources for this. But something that keeps track of, I'm working on this specific task, it took this long, and then you can track. What you don't track, what you don't measure, you can't grow and you can't repair. So keep that in mind. If you're the type of person who needs to have the accountability of a time tracker, then invest in that right from the beginning. The other thing you can do is apply formulas to convert time measurements. For example, if it takes 10 minutes to edit 1 minute of audio, then multiply that by the episode length, for example. This will give you some rough parameters when somebody asks you for a quote. You'll have a good idea of what it's going to take to do that based on your historical reference and data that you can pull from past projects. And again, if you don't have a podcast, it's pretty hard to have that when you're starting out because you have no point of reference. So start a podcast and be a podcaster and talk about your business so that you know what it takes to record an episode. It's really going to help you. And the fact that you don't have a podcast as a podcast editor, I think, could be something that holds you back slightly. So think about it. And if you want to start a podcast, reach out to me. I'd love to help you. So use formulas. That's really going to help you on the spot to come up with numbers that you can use to talk to clients and potential people that you may want to work with you. Understand your numbers and understand how to do those quotes. And then consider that the industry standard for a well-made podcast is about 3 hours of editing per 1 hour of content, plus about an hour for converting and saving and uploading and all the other stuff that goes along with it. So like a 4-to-1 ratio is a good kind of rule of thumb that I kind of use for myself, and that's for audio podcasting. If I was to convert this over to a video conversation, instead of a 4-to-1 ratio, I would say it's more like a 8, 9, 10-to-1 ratio. A lot higher, almost, I would say even double or even more for a video component to a podcast on a regular basis. And then what a lot of podcasters don't understand, if you're a podcaster listening to this, is that if it's a 10-to-1 ratio, 10 hours for a 1 hour podcast Are you as a podcaster willing to pay for 10 hours of editing every week or every episode to have video? Is there a return on your investment? Yes or no? If it's a business and video is your thing and your stuff needs to be seen on camera and you have the budget for it, reach out to me. I'd love to talk to you because I'd love to work with you, because most of the podcasters I talk to, they can't even afford the audio version of editing, and they try to do it themselves, get frustrated, and sometimes quit. So I'm encouraging you to, as a podcaster and a podcast editor, to know your numbers and know what you can do and come prepared to have a robust conversation so that you are not sidetracked or disillusioned by the cost and time required to do podcast editing right. Your podcast is going to benefit. Your listeners are going to be more engaged. There'll be big wins for everyone involved if you do it right. The third part in this conversation is all around including time for client communication, revisions, and managing the project. It's going to take time. Podcast editors don't work in a vacuum in that they never interact with their clients. They never have one-on-one coffee chats with their clients. They never spend time building relationships and rapport and understanding their clients. There's a lot of things that happen behind the scenes beyond taking the ums and ahs out of an episode. They're slapping on an intro and outro and we're good to go. You need to also include time in your calendar to be available to your clients for the communication. And maybe there's a change, a revision. There's something you missed. You need to be available for those as well. So in all the things we've already covered, I need you to add on top of that 5 to 10 hours plus 1 to 3 hours per episode for all overall project management. So you're adding a lot of time to your calendar just to manage the process and your client. Factor in time for client meetings, feedback sessions, future planning, research, guest research, developing your podcast. Factor in time for that. Include time for file management, backing up your files, quality control checks, maintenance on your system and file maintenance. There's a lot of different things that go on behind the scenes, again, beyond the ums and ahs. Remember as well that this time estimate is just kind of a baseline. It's not the final price determinant when you sit down with your podcaster to talk about time and money. When you sit down with your podcaster, consider the complexity of the project that you're talking about. Also, look at the number of episodes that are going to be done on the podcast and any additional services needed beyond the editing of the audio or the video. What else is included? What else are you looking for? And then factor in the quality of the audio that comes to you from the podcaster. Podcaster, here's a tip. If you want to save time and money with your editor, record great content and great audio and great video at the source. What comes to us, if it's a hot mess, is going to be a less hot mess by the time we're done with it, but it's still going to be a mess. The better the quality that comes to your editor, the better the result. So using a real mic, using a quiet location, shutting off your phone, not tapping the table with your foot the entire time, putting the dog outside of the room, finding something for the kids to do so they're not yelling at you from the other part of the house, not recording on a busy street next to the highway with a jet plane flying over you. Any of these things are going to make it easier for your podcast editor to make you sound great. Now, there are some wizards out there that can do amazing things with podcasting and with really bad audio, but you're going to pay for that. It's going to take time. It's going to take resources. It's going to take money. And if you're not willing to part with any of those things, then do better at how you record your episode. Your podcast editor is going to love you. You're going to get better results, and it's going to save you a lot of money. So factor in the quality of the source of the audio that comes to you. Poor quality audio may require more editing time, and it's going to be a little more frustrating for everyone involved. So my plea to you as a podcaster, get better audio. Start it at the source, and the trickle-down effect is going to be greater for you down the road if you present the best quality you can with what you have. And then in all of this, we need to adjust our estimates based on the desired level of polish and detail. The whole thing, what does good look like to you, is a great question to sit down and talk to your podcaster about right from the beginning. What does good sound like? What does good look like? Those are things that you need to know. And then share examples, because your opinion of what good looks like or sounds like from an editing point of view might be completely different than what your podcaster is looking for. So make sure that you're on the same page on this and you understand what good looks like. It really will help you. For a typical podcast episode, the total time investment can range from 80 hours, 2 weeks for some podcasts, for writing, recording, and editing, to 10 to 14 hours per finished hour of audio for more complex productions. These are just estimates. Again, I wanted to show you some of the higher amounts of time and effort it takes. Results are going to vary. Mileage will vary. Everything's going to change based on your setup and your requirements. These estimates can vary significantly, but based on specific requirements of each project and efficiency of your workflow. But you need a starting point. And to run around without a starting point, without a point of reference, without tracking numbers, without knowing your history as an editor, you're going to run into some pretty difficult conversations, which could lead to loss of clients, frustrated clients, hardships, because you don't know your numbers and you don't know where you're starting from. I've used this example many times. If I'm on my way to your house and I get lost and I call you up and I'm like, dude, I can't find your house. I don't know how to get to your place. How do I get there? The first question you're going to ask me is, where are you? Right? You want to know where I am so that you can help redirect me and get me back on course to find your house. So I have to know where I am so that you can help me to get to where I need to be. And if you don't even know where you are as a podcast editor and support person, if you don't even know where you are as a podcaster, then let's establish that first before you go and start talking to editors. And editors, before you start talking to clients, you need to know your starting point. So I'm ready to pick up the phone and answer the call. If you don't know where you are and you're stuck and you don't know how to get to where you want to go, then reach out to me, podcasteditingandsupport.com. You can leave me a message. You can send me an email. We can jump on a Zoom if you want, and we'll just have a conversation. I'd love to help you and steer you in the right direction, whether it's working with me or someone else. But at least you have somebody in your corner that you can ask questions of. I've been doing this for a long time. I have a lot of episodes behind me. I work with some great clients on their shows. And whatever you need, from small to large, from A to Z, I love to help you. Reach out to me through podcasteditingandsupport.com. Reach out to me through truemediasolutions.ca. It's my overarching podcast editing and support group that I have for podcasters. Would love to help you. Again, thank you for being here. Thank you for listening to the show. And thank you for sharing the show with somebody in your world who's either thinking about being an editor or thinking of hiring an editor. This is the Podcast Editing and Support Show. Thanks for listening to the Podcast Editing and Support Show. Visit us at podcasteditingandsupport.com, podcasteditingandsupport.com. We would love to help you find a great podcast editor, or if you want to hire us, we would love to work with you. Podcasteditingandsupport.com. Catch you on the next episode. Take care.